Hello and welcome to Let's Talk. I'm John Kane. I think Shawnee Rice is joining me. I believe she's on her way, but I've got a good show planned for today anyway. So, but some of it is going to reference my guest from last week. I got to talk a little bit more about Lance Gumbs and what's happening with the battle with out in Shinnecock with the Hamptons and all that stuff, because it demonstrates something that I really want to talk about, which and I've talked about racism before, and this is always a tough situation because the second you say the word racism, you get a whole lot of white people who start to like shiver a little bit. Oh no, he's not going to talk about racism again. But I think what is clearly demonstrated with the situation out there in Long Island is how racism that is in the hearts of individuals becomes systemic racism. How does somebody who has a personal belief about people being beneath them or that they should have control over or whatever, how that goes from being a personal belief to being a belief that that gets supported or an ideology that gets supported in the media. It gets supported with local town councils. It gets supported by county legislators. It gets supported by state legislators and even federal regulators and legislators, courts, judges, police. So I want to talk about how racism, which most people can, when they think about racism, they only think about it in the context of whether a person is a racist. And what gets lost in this stuff, and I've got to say it over and over and over again, is that what makes racism different than, say, racial bias or even discrimination is that racism has a power dynamic component to it. Racism is about a belief that there is a genetic superiority that comes with racial designation. And in a situation in the United States and in many areas where European colonialism still exists, I have to say this over and over again, and it always rubs some people the wrong way. Racism isn't a right thing, it's a white thing. Because if you have, what we're seeing out in Long Island, for instance, is that these aren't just Republicans out there. Look, some of those rich people in the Hamptons, they're some of the most solid liberal voices in the country. Now, I'm not saying every liberal is lodging their complaint against the Shinnecock, but the fact of the matter is there's plenty of racial bias that exists within the people who have power, and that power that they have because of their wealth or their affluence or their whatever their significance is, they utilize that by affecting laws, by affecting enforcement of laws, and even by affecting how our kids are taught things in school. That's where racism becomes systemic. And that's why it is such an important distinction from, say, racial bias. Oh, look, I know I get the same caller every time I talk about racism. He says, "Well, I reject all racism, whether it's black racist, white racist," and of course there is no such thing, because this is what I've tried to explain every single time. There is a distinction between racial bias, which I don't agree with either. I don't support racial bias either. But there's a distinction between racial bias and racism. Racism is, again, it's about power. It's about the belief in a superiority-inferiority dichotomy. And what you see play out in Shinnecock on Long Island is what you're seeing is this. What is clearly a view held by the wealthy white people of the Hamptons that they should be able to dictate what the Shinnecock do on their own lands. And no matter, and of course, it affects even the ability to establish the distinction between a native people and a non-native people. It makes it even more difficult to establish the distinction between native land and non-native land. And we can get into a debate over land title There is a difference on how native land is held, at least in many native territories. There's trust lands. There's lands that are held in fee, which means absolute title. And again, and as I mentioned it last week, there's no way in hell that the state or non-native people around our areas out in Seneca territory would be telling us that we can't put a sign up. I mean, one of the guys who sponsors my show back home, he actually constructed a sign that goes over the highway. And we're talking about U.S. Route 5 and 20, or no, Route 20, I guess it is. U.S. Route 20 in Western New York. He put up this big sign that advertises his gas station with a big arrow that points, and the base is off the shoulder of the road, but it comes up and it goes over, pretty much right over the shoulder of the road. I mean, there's no way in hell that thing is compliant with DOT standards. But you know what? Nobody's going to tell us what to do back home. Well, we got billboards, we got signs. There's to a certain extent there's certain things we won't do. We don't necessarily drive onto the thruway without using the entrance ramps that are there. So there's certain things that we don't do. But I'll tell you, again, one of my buddies, he bulldozed. He gave everybody the impression he was building his own on-ramp from his territory onto the thruway. And there were write-ups in the paper, but nobody wrote a cease and desist order. So all right, I want to welcome Shawnee. She kept straggling in. Yes. So, but I mean, you had to be somewhat moved by what transpired last week with Lansing Studio, talking about just the sheer arrogance that that is demonstrated by again the fight over whether the Shinnecock can even build a sign on their lands.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have many white friends who would have that sort of opinion or blind spot in how...
None of your friends from the Hamptons?
Well,
you could have friends from the Hamptons. I don't want to say that you couldn't.
No, I mean, I don't. I mean, yeah, I don't. I've never been there, actually, but which I guess also is why I'm kind of like struck so much about how big of a blind spot this is and how much... I mean, like the trends are like white communities, whether good intentions or bad, want to be more inclusive, and if they're supposed to be liberal,
and yet we still have things like the Ramapo situation. And in fact, over at the community house tonight, they're going to show a screening of the documentary on Split Rock Sweetwater Prayer Camp and kind of what they've gone through, and that's another exact example of white people trying to say, oh, well, we can't let native people do something on their land, and so it's just more of that same attitude. And again, this isn't a right or left issue. This, there's plenty of this that gets lodged in the hearts of liberal Democrats, just as it does with with conservative Republicans, and so that's what plays out with this. But what I wanted to talk is how it goes from there. How it goes from a few blustery people saying, well, I'm not going to stand for this, to how they make sure that they don't have to stand for this. And this is what I'm talking about, is when people with money and affluence and influence can affect a state legislator or a county legislator or a town, a town councilor or whatever else. I mean, it's sometimes amazing how much resistance. I got to tell you, I spoke in front of the Niagara Falls City Council after the mayor of Niagara Falls at a 9/11 commemoration stood up and tried to compare the first responders down here in New York with the 19th century cavalry.
Right.
The same 19th century cavalry that slaughtered Native people at Sand Creek and Wounded Knee. He suggested that, in his mind, that the 19th century cavalry, I'm sure they were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Americans, these hardy young men, on horseback driving into harm's way. Yeah, they're driving into harm's way because they were trying to kill people. And to compare that to the first responders who went into that building to save people who perished, to me was absurd. And so I went in front of the city council. Now, some of these people on city council are Republicans. They're not just, and he's a Democrat, by the way. That sounds like I know the instinct is to think, well, that must have been a Republican that would say something like that. No, this was a Democrat. And I went there, and the mayor is sitting right there at these the city council meetings. And I addressed the council, the Republicans and the Democrats on that council, and I said, I ask that you condemn what that mayor's your mayor's comments. I'm asking that you, as a city council, separate yourself from those racist comments. I had people standing in applause behind me, but not one of those city councilors would offer up a resolution, condemning the comments or offering some sort of separation. Even the Republicans on that. So even though there were politics at play, because look, the Republicans on that city council probably loved me condemning a Democratic mayor, but I was condemning racism. So there wasn't even a black guy on the city council seat there, and no, he just sat there real silent too. So it's like. This is how the influence of people with money, power, or position, prestige, get to affect policy. I mean, this mayor was speaking on behalf of the city of Niagara Falls. I mean, he also took his shots at the Seneca Nation and blamed them for the city having poorly equipped first responders themselves, and it was all nonsense. But the sheer analogy of and comparison of first responders in New York City at 9/11 to again, it's nice and romantic to picture, the 7th Cavalry as, didn't they used to do a laundry commercial back in the day or something like that? Like, no, these weren't sparkling, too old for you.
Yeah. No clue.
These are sparkling, white, dashing young men. Most of these guys were derelicts, who were in the military because they had nothing else to do, or no other skill set. Well, they were Indian killers, basically.
All of these comments, and all of this, the reflections with this is just the reactions hit differently, and it's not as controversial.
Yep.
No one's policing the way that white people are talking about indigenous groups. I mean, there are some folks, but it's not as big as other groups.
It's funny, because you say that. We see this play out on Facebook, right? I mean, I know a lot of people who try to report pages that are promoting like the mascot issue and some of this use of native slurs and that kind of stuff. And Facebook says, it doesn't really violate our community standards.
Exactly.
The interesting thing was, during last year around the 4th of July, somebody had posted an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence that referred to us as merciless Indian savages. That violated the community standards for Facebook, and Facebook actually struck down somebody including an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence because it said merciless Indian savages. That crossed the line, I guess. Just calling somebody a redskin, I guess, as long as you don't put dirty in front of it like it used to be always done in the press and that kind of stuff, it's still okay, I guess. Or you can call somebody a savage, but not an ignorant or a merciless savage, apparently. Or I don't know what the standard is. But then Facebook had to back down from that because, look, it's a revered document of the United States. It's a foundational document of the United States, and the fact that it has a racist line in there is just, it's a matter of fact. So, I mean, it is interesting, but you're right. It's hard to police this kind of stuff. So I wanted to throw this out there, and I want to thank again Lance Gums for coming into the studio last week. As a follow-up, their court hearing, which was the last Friday, the day after last week's show, pretty much just kicked the can. Not a whole lot of, there really nothing changed. There's another hearing, I think, next week. But I did see in one of the newspapers they had written that again, the paper complained almost that the Shinnecock still were not complying with the restraining orders, and their sign was still up, and it was still flashing advertisements and that kind of stuff. So, but I wanted to bring that up. But I also I wanted to make sure that today, because we came off the fund drive, I've had a couple of guests in studio. I haven't had a chance to really rely heavily on the callers. I will say I was a little disappointed with some of the callers we had last week. Look, I encourage people to call in, and I do try. I hope that when a caller calls in, that we can participate in a meaningful conversation. And sometimes they aren't so meaningful. And I don't mind if something a little outrageous gets said, I guess. But I'm not gonna provide a soapbox for somebody to just go on and on about something that's not consistent with the show. So I mean, I don't mind a different opinion. But so I do want to. I'm going to go to open the phone lines up now. So the number is 212-209-2877. There's a whole number of things that we can talk about. Obviously, we've talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women in the run up to some of the stuff, and that's clearly related to some of this systemic racism. Certainly talk about what we talked about last week with Lance Gumbs and the Shinnecock situation. Last night I did a screening of Drunk Town's Finest out there at the Cinema Arts Center in Huntington. It was a good crowd that came out, and I appreciate those who came out, and good conversation afterwards. And of course that film even addresses transgender issues, which was fitting for Pride Month and that kind of thing. So, again, we can talk about any number of things. So I want to put the number out. It's 212-209-2877. That's the number to call in to be a part of the show. A couple of things. Again, I want to reiterate that. There is a screening of the Ramapo documentary at the American Indian Community House. That's at 39 Elder Street. It's on the 4th floor in Manhattan, and so that's 7 o'clock tonight. I'm going to try to get over there. I don't know if I can stay for the whole thing, but I'm going to try to get over there this evening. I don't know. Were you planning on trying to? I'm going to try to get over there. We'll see how that goes. So I want to put that out there, and it's related. I mean, it's a perfect part of the conversation as it relates to just what the Shinnecock are going through out on Long Island and the Ramapo are dealing with in Mawa. So it's I encourage people that if you're in the area, if you have the opportunity, it's a good chance to stop by and maybe learn a little bit more about what that form of systemic racism looks like. I also want to mention that this show does get posted on SoundCloud and does get offered up as a podcast through SoundCloud. So it'll hit all your favorite podcast platforms. It will be listed with my other show from back home, which is Let's Talk Native. So if you go to SoundCloud and look for Let's Talk Native, you can find both the Let's Talk Native shows and the Let's Talk shows here from WBAI. So not only can you hear this show on the archives of WBAI, and obviously we are streaming live on WBAI.org, and of course we're streaming live on Facebook Live. So you
also
can.
Just as we're talking about dates, there's Drums Along the Mohawk, or Drums Along the Hudson, which is coming up.
Mohawk's the other river.
I know. June 26th, and that's in Wood Park in Upper Manhattan. And that's going to be all day, and there's a ton of vendors. There's dancing, there's food, and all of that too as well. So.
All right, cool. All right, we'll go to. We got a caller on the line. Yeah. All right. Again, let me give the number out because we've got a phone bank now, so we can load you up. So if you're interested in being on the show, 212-209-2877, and we'll peck away at you as we go. Caller, you're up first. What's your name and where are you calling from? Hold on, my headphones. Oh, there we go.
Hi.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for taking the call. My name, L, from Long Island. And I'd like to make a comment on a question of one of the previous hosts, or guest on your show, Asiba Tubahachi. I think I pronounced her name.
On this show?
This is going back years.
That doesn't ring a bell. But anyway, what was the subject matter? Not
your show, but an indigenous show. Last week, I think it was, a gentleman had mentioned and couldn't recall the name, but I remember her, Asiba Tubahachi. But now, in regards to the sign out in Southampton there, I think that yes, we can say it is a form of discrimination, but I look at it from this point. It's containment, and it is a challenge. What do I mean by a challenge? I think that the indigenous people here were not expected, are not accepted, and all treaties that were made were broken, of course. So you see, for people who think of themselves and know that they are free to do what they wish on their own land is a challenge.
Well,
Now,
you know, and Al, one thing I've got to say is that this goes beyond what is whether a treaty is broken or not, because what the assumption is, and this is the problem that exists with our existence in an environment around us this way, is the assumption is that we have somehow ceded our power. And unless we have, explicitly, protected a specific right, like a fishing right or a hunting right, that all of the other rights have disappeared. And see, that's the problem. We in this situation, you've got, the folks of the Hamptons who believe that they have the power to dictate to the Shinnecock what they can do on their lands. And there may be no place, and in fact, I'm sure there's no place where they can ever find in any historical record that the Shinnecock have ceded that power or that authority away, nor is there any place that these towns or townships can say that they have some legal authority where they can prove that they've assumed that authority, even if assumption was enough. So I think we oftentimes get into this conversation, and my own people have a tendency to put an overemphasis on treaty and treaty protected rights, but we have to not just pretend that that we have to have a paper that said we protected something. If we're trying to really assert that we have the rights for our free use and enjoyment of our lands.
Let me say this. I agree with you 100 times 100%. That is why I said challenge. You present a challenge because you stand for what is correct. You stand for what is, quote, equality. You stand for what is inheritance. You stand as a man.
Well, and I think the other thing that distinction that I think sometimes gets missed is the difference between a civil right and a human right. And a civil right is oftentimes a right within the legal structure that you're battling for those rights in. Where Native people are oftentimes, we're not trying to fight for a constitutional right or a civil right within the social justice system of the United States. We're fighting for a right that we never gave up as a human being. And as another species of life, and so and I think we don't oftentimes understand that while Native people very much support many of the battles that play out over civil rights, what we're fighting for is not a right within the system, but a right that is separate and outside the system.
I understand perfectly what you said, and I agree. But I say this, and I just would like to make this point. You see, when you stand for what the gods have given you, all right, what you are entitled to by being a human being, by being in this world, okay? When you challenge someone who claims or who pretends that they are gods, they are either descendants from straight gods, therefore they had the power to what? Own. Remember, it's the papal bull.
Yep.
Okay?
Absolutely.
All right? So that is what they use as a form of authority to say we are better than you, we are smarter than you, we know much more than you. Why? Because our civilization, our culture, has placed us on top of the world.
Yeah, and their voice of God, their popes, offer them decrees that allowed them to view non-Christians as less than human, as beneath them, as inferior to them, and as a people that could have their lands taken, their lives taken, their possessions taken, and their freedom taken.
So you see the fear and the challenge is, this is what the fear of that some people fear.
Yeah.
That if you stand and show this independence, then others will follow suit. And generation after generation will say, hey, yes, we can stand and we can do it. And what does that mean? It means that the form of what? Control, the capital control over the land, the money-making process. Because when you go out east, it's nothing but, money-making.
Yep.
I've been out there. All right? So it's not that they fear you as a people so much. They fear that you will take away their economic stance.
El, I want to thank you so much for the call. Your comments are well placed, and the one thing I will add to and actually this kind of proves out in history, I guess. You talked about how once they can establish this trampling or this or them overcoming our challenges, they think they can embed it in their laws, and I talk about this before, but here's the actual quote from Johnson v. McIntosh. This is Chief Justice John Marshall, and this is a comment that he makes in his legal opinion. He says, however extravagant the pretension of converting the discovery of an inhabited country into conquest may appear, if the principle has been asserted in the first instance and afterwards sustained, it becomes the law of the land and cannot be questioned. So, think about that. This is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1826, basically saying, however preposterous, however extravagant this notion, this pretension, this pretended idea, this pretend concept that we can equate the discovery of an inhabited land with conquest of the land of the people, however extravagant that may be, if we can get away with it and it can go unchallenged long enough, we can say, look, that's just a law. That's just a law. We get into this debate about what is legal. Well, what is legal? Slavery was legal. Genocide was legal. Massacres were legal. And there were plenty of crimes that while were not legal, because they're never prosecuted, it ends up being the same as being legal. So whether it's lynching a man or whether it's missing and murder indigenous women, if things aren't investigated, if they aren't prosecuted, if people aren't held to account, that's the same thing as it being legal. And if you can establish that in the first instance and then sustain it, it becomes the law of the land. So, El, I want to thank you for your comments. I want to get to other callers. So, caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hi, this is George from New Jersey. How are you?
Hey, George. How you doing?
All right. Can you just clarify something for me? What's the difference between tribes? Was it just location, or did they have an extra feather in their head? Did they wear certain stripes on their face to identify them? Was it just by location that they were like a different tribe? Is that how that works, like states?
Yeah. Well, what's the difference between white people?
No, but what I'm getting at is, it doesn't seem to me that you guys are learning anything. About history.
All right, you can dump this moron. We don't need to listen to that stuff. Jeez. All right. If anybody
was the even point?
If anybody really needs to know, look, there are thousands of distinct Native peoples that have lived and do live across North and South America. And it's almost an ignorant conversation to ask, well, what's the difference? Is it
almost?
A feather sticking out of their head. He did ask, is it regional? And I'll give him that. You can.
First of all, no. When a white person asks you, is a feather sticking out of your head, or if there's stripes on your face?
He didn't start there at least. But no, you're right.
That's a racist comment waiting to happen.
This is more of that. And this is what we come to expect with some of our talkback programs. So, George, you lived up to the expectations. So I hope you don't speak for all of New Jersey. I don't believe you have, because we've had some great callers, and hopefully somebody from New Jersey will redeem that side of the river. All right, caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from? Hello.
Peace. This is Brother Shep from the Boogie Down Bronx.
All right, Brother Shep. How you doing, sir?
I'm good, my brother.
How you been? Long time no see.
Hey, I'm always staying busy, man. You know that.
Yeah, I know that.
You get my emails, so you know.
Yes, I do. I follow them. Unfortunately, most of your events are on the weekend, and unfortunately, I'm only here in the middle of the week. But look, I look for them, and at some point, I'll stretch my stay over a weekend, and I'm going to hit you up on some of these things that you're sending me. I sure appreciate being kept in the loop.
We still got to head upstate. But in any case, dealing with the Shinnecock, just from a historical, perspective, looking at the fact that, from the late, 1600s, 1700s, and even the 1800s. When we look at, escaped black slaves that, were able to go to Long Island and seek refuge there. And, just that whole, historical aspect, that most people don't know about. I mean, if you went to the Shinnecock Nation and you looked around, you think you was in Harlem. I mean, that's for real, And my whole thing, with this whole, call that I'm putting in is that, we need to look at that whole situation. When you talk about racism and how the rich folks there in the Hamptons, deal what they're dealing with, even to the point where they had to have that big fight, to even have the right to have a casino if they wanted to have one, and all of that. Folks are, just a couple hours away. We need to go out there, when they have their, gatherings.
Yeah, Labor Day they do their Shinnecock powwow. It's a big event. I mean, there's plenty of reason to go out into the region, and and frankly, the Shinnecock would welcome people coming through. I mean, obviously they do have a retail sector associated with with tobacco and other things, but and plenty of other stuff. But you're right. I think people. It's funny that to have an idiot like the previous caller, say that Native people don't seem to be learning anything, and then a guy just displays his utter ignorance with a comment. Look, I realize that there are people who live in the city or in the burbs or whatever else who may never travel more than 20 miles away from their home. There's a big world out there outside of New York City, folks.
Yeah. Yeah. Not to mention even going overseas, but just within, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah. Well, Shep,
there's a museum out there and everything.
Oh yeah, no, they've got a big museum. Yeah, they do. And there's a lot of events that happen in that region that are near the Shinnecock that the Shinnecock participate into. So I mean anything any kind of outdoor community event that's happening in that region, there's usually vendors from the Shinnecock that participate in there and from Poospatuck and the Uncochuck people as well. I usually see my friend Harry Wallace out there. He does wampum production from real wampum created from shells. There's a lot to experience with knowing that there are Native people who live in the region. Look, there's 100,000 Native people who live in the New York City area, but it's hard to view them as a community. If you go out to Long Island, or if you go catch up with the Ramapo, you can actually view some of these folks when they invite you in, that you can view them as a community, and I think you get a stronger sense for that. But I want to thank you, Shep, for the call. You hit it. I mean, that's when we see there has been a shared experience between black people and Native people in the whole the history of colonialization and imperialism, and the way that shared history has bound our people together. Even while there are distinctions, and I go back to my conversation with Elle, there is a difference between fighting for civil rights versus human rights, and some people fight for one and not the other, unfortunately. But there's a lot of shared experiences there, and we see that play out even as our peoples have come together historically. So I appreciate that. All right, caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, John. Hey, Shawnee. This is Jeff from Union County, New Jersey, and I guess I got a lot on my plate now because I got to redeem my.
You got to redeem New Jersey. I'm sorry.
Listen, I really want to apologize for that second caller. He was submoronic and. There was no place for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
It just reminds me of back in the day, old school BAI, when the guy would call in every week on a particular show and say, "Go back to Cuba, you commies."
Oh my God.
Anyway, I don't want to waste too much time, but I want to tell you. First of all, I want to thank you because I'm a middle-aged, upper middle-aged Caucasian, and I don't want to use the term woke because I think it's a bit too trendy and pretentious. But your show in particular and BAI in general have expanded my horizons.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could say this on the air. I imagine I can, but, as a Caucasian, I think the average white person goes through life with their head up their butt.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to grow. I mean, I'm 64 years old, but I'm still open to learning. And I mean, we grew up lower middle class. I grew up in Irvington, New Jersey. We my father had a house, but he bought it for $5,000. I mean, we had one black and white TV, no air conditioning, no phone. But then I grew up and I married a woman from the Philippines. I went to the Philippines and I got an eyeful of what real poverty is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, poverty is relative. If
yeah.
you live meagerly with McMansions surrounding you, you think you're poor. But then you go to the third world and you say, well, geez, I never went to sleep hungry.
And you don't have to go to the Philippines because I'll tell you,
That's
there
true.
are
You're
places,
right.
there are native
But
territories.
I saw it with my own eyes. That's what I'm saying.
There are native territories across North America on the Canadian and the U.S. side of that imaginary line that where there's true abject poverty. It's funny.
Appalachia.
Well,
Appalachia.
and it's crazy because we talk about bomb trains coming from the North Dakota and actually coming right down the Hudson River on the Jersey side, as a matter of fact. So all of that, this Bakken crude is being pulled out of the land up there. Natural gas is being pulled out of land, and yet every year. You don't hear it, but folks who are connected with indigenous people, we hear of native people who froze to death in their homes because they couldn't afford natural gas or because they didn't their power went out and nobody really cared. I mean, so it's amazing when you look at that distinction. But I got to tell you, Jeff, I appreciate the call. You did redeem yourself and redeem New Jersey but one of the things that I have to say. It almost doesn't matter where you are in the economic scale when it comes to the education that you get, because the schools still teach the same crap. I mean, they're still gonna teach the Disney version of Pocahontas, which isn't true. It's an outright lie. They're still gonna teach the single point of origin theory that all Native people came from the Bering Strait. That's still. I mean, I just went through this with my fourth grader grandson, and I had to tell him that's not true. And it does. The Bering Strait theory doesn't even rise to the level of being a theory. It does. It's barely qualifies as a hypothesis because, what a theory is when you accumulate. It's like science, right? I mean, you accumulate data and you let this data lead you to a conclusion. If you've already got the conclusion in your mind and you're only trying to gather the data that supports your conclusion, you can't make a theory from that. And that's the problem with the way that's the way history is taught. And so, I mean, everybody, including Native people who are being educated in public schools, we get this constant drumbeat and this indoctrination of the American story that only half of it is true, and even the true parts are only half true. So, I mean, and that's the difficulty, and that's why some of this stuff can continue. And and it does. It falls right back to even things like the mascot issue, when we can't even have an intelligent conversation about why it is wrong for a school to make a mockery of Native imagery, Native names, or use Native racial slurs, or our dance or any part of our custom or tradition. And when that is like an unpalatable conversation to have. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I applaud. Maine is the only state in the United States that said, you know what, we're forbidding this. We're not going to let this happen anymore. So as a state, the state of Maine passed a law that said they forbids schools. I mean, again, these are publicly funded institutions. And they said, no, we're not going to allow you to utilize the racist practice of using a living human being, population of human beings, as your form of entertainment to make a mockery of. But I mean, so that's where so the education affects us all.
But I do just also want to commend Jeff for being open, especially at 64. I think a lot of people in that age who come from like a low economic household don't have the luxury or the free time or the ability to like want to grow and expand, because if all you know is like putting food on the table and we're never education and expanding was never a priority, as opposed to just working all the time. Like that's a great thing which is
part of the reason that some of this ideology that can be associated with racism remains, because it makes it hard for people to confront that stuff that may not affect them directly. And so, we all have our nose to the grindstone in such a way that we, oftentimes don't have time to consider. Forget about sympathy or empathy. We can't understand what people are going through.
Let's talk right now. You can make this comparison about Sudan.
Yeah, sure.
Sudan versus the biggest meme that I've seen so far, which I love, is let's save that energy that you had for the burning building and France, the cathedral, for the folks in Sudan. Yeah.
Yeah, or millions of dollars. Will get raised, and of course,
in
hours of media time, and yet we won't discuss the stuff that's really affecting us. Yeah. All right, caller. We'll go to another caller. Caller, you're up next. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Brother Kane.
Hey, what's going on?
Hey, John Kane. Thanks for taking the call.
Sure.
This is Brother Mark from Co-op City.
Hey, good to hear from you.
Hey, John, man. I've been listening to you and Teokas and Ghost Horse for a while now, and I really, really admire you men for being persistent with the indigenous vibration.
I got Shawnee sitting right beside me here, so
yes, Shawnee. Well, Shawnee.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna let you get away with just saying men here.
Yeah. We love you too, Shawnee.
I'm within striking distance.
Shawnee, you know what?
Yes.
Shawnee, you know what? You are the great mother.
Oh, thank you.
You are the great mother, period.
Thank you.
But, John, I want to say something real quick. I'll be quick as I can. John, you go into the courtroom, correct?
Yes, I have. I've testified as an expert witness for folks. Yep.
Yes, and when you go in the courtroom, when you go in there and present yourself, you give them your status, correct?
Well, I identify myself. Yes.
Right. So, John, I'm saying that to say that is our problem as a mixed up black and white people, because there is no black and white. There is status.
Well, but the word that we use, is ungwe, and that word means a real human being. So when I use that word, again, I guess it does talk about status, but the first thing that it expresses is that I am a free human being.
Got you.
There you go.
But John, the court system that really is controlled by the Vatican overall, they don't recognize white and black. They don't. And that's the problem with us people that look white and look black, because it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
We have to find out our lineage, and then when we have to present ourselves, we don't have to present ourselves by waiting for the courtroom to tell you who you are.
Right.
Because the court tells you, okay, what's your name? And then you give them your name, and then right there, you waive your rights. So it's more to it than that, but that's our problem, John. We don't know our real status as an indigenous group of people that has hue on our skin, which is melanin.
Yeah.
That's our problem.
Yeah.
So we get kicked around, bumped around, knocked off our lands, and we just call the police and get lawyers, and it's much ado about nothing. Well,
and that's where, and I have a different view on that. But to me, I think that we have to resist, and I do have a problem with, for the first thing is that most of this lawyering up, we're essentially hiring people who have vowed loyalty to the U.S. Constitution in the first place, and that's what their job is, to defend that, and so oftentimes, and I see this time and time again, and I'm usually trying to offer an opinion that is the antithesis of what lawyers are offering up, because they're figuring out ways that they can use the system to create a loophole to slip through. And I'm saying, no, we got to confront this stuff head on. And I agree with you. We got to confront it head on as who we are as human beings and as free human beings.
Yes, John. Hey, John, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for calling. I appreciate it. It was great to hear your perspective, and I think you're right. I think you're right on that. All right, I think we got time for one more call. So, caller, you're up next. You're up last. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Bill from White Plains.
All right, let's see if we can get some volume. Can you speak as close as you can to your mouthpiece, because you seem to be a little bit quiet. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Is this better?
That's a little better. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to talk about that guy from New Jersey. He must be out of his mind. He sees you guys calling every white person a racist, and he calls in and starts a racist argument with you.
Yeah, it's like okay, sign me up. I want to be the token racist for the show today. I don't know.
No, what I'm saying is you're calling every white person a racist. So why would he call up and try to defend himself like by being a racist? I mean, you already called him a racist, so he might as well be a racist.
No,
right?
no, I'm not calling every person a racist. I'm not calling every white person a racist. I
said every white person is a racist.
No, I never said anything of the sort. I said.
I think we could go to the archives. I'll pull it up, and you.
Well, you can go to the archives all you want. I never said all white. I said racism is a white thing. I didn't say all.
It is right.
I didn't say all white people are racist. That's a different conversation.
Is it nationality or racism when you're a Lenape or you're a Cherokee? Is that a nationality or is that a race?
Well, I don't see. I don't think. I don't think we have to. I don't even subscribe to what the race classification in the first place. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't agree that racism exists, because if you believe in the classification of race and the categorization of race, by color, by ethnicity, or however you want to do it, if you're one of those ones who subscribe to that. And you can see that when you can clearly see that there are people who utilize their standing as white people to oppress others, then that's racism. Now, I don't necessarily have to agree that a white person is even a distinct race from me. But what I can say is that they've certainly enabled themselves to enjoy white privilege.
Do you think that, like you just said something good, I want to go. The white man has gone all over from the north, and he went all over to the south. He went all over the place, and he has conquered people. And guess what? He were always outnumbered, the white man. Has always been outnumbered when he stepped ashore, and through lying or whatever, through their bosses lying, through the deceit, whatever you want to call it, they have conquered people that do not stick together. They separate themselves. They didn't use the racism that God gave them.
Perhaps you didn't hear the quote that I had from one of your esteemed Supreme Court justices. He doesn't say that. He basically says we're just going to say that we discovered you, and so we're going to equate discovery with conquest. There's not a whole lot of conquest that actually took place in North America. You can actually count on one hand the number of official military conflicts, maybe two hands, that took place between Native people. There's over 1,000 distinct Native peoples. Just to suggest that the United States has conquered all Native peoples and they can declare conquest over. That's why they have to use a doctrine like the one from Justice Marshall to claim. Well, if we can assert. And however bizarre and preposterous it is, that discovery is the same as conquest. If we can say it and nobody challenges us on it, and of course we wouldn't even know that they were even saying it, then they can say we can embed it in our law. So they can say law is a virtue, or conquest is a virtue of their law, but it doesn't mean that it's true. So when you talk about white man's conquest, look, I think you can clearly show where there's been some military dominance has been demonstrated, but usually that was the way that white people were able to do this was usually to prey upon the good nature of people to allow them in the first place. Trust me, it would have been really easy to kill the first white man who stepped off the boat on our shores, but because we didn't do that. I mean, and you can call us suckers or ignorant or whatever else for not doing that.
I'm a sucker, too. I'm a sucker like that, too. I try to look at the nicer part of people. That's why I'm taking it for granted that you are not a total anti-white person that just goes on and on about how racist white people are. I think you're a decent human being that just got hurt, his feelings hurt by white people, and now he hates them, and he has to say everything bad about white people he can.
I don't say everything bad about white people that I can. So I don't. So you got that wrong. I mean, the assumptions that you're making is incorrect.
Also, the basis of the show isn't all talking about white people. It's talking about our problems that we have that is mostly caused by the history of our interactions with colonizers and white people on the show. But the show isn't complaining about white people the whole show. So if you've listened to any of this, you would know that. But it seems like you're just catching some comments here and there.
Unfortunately, Bill, you're picking up, some of the, you're only a couple of steps off of, George from New Jersey, I'm afraid, if that's the way you're assuming the conversation. Look, we're pretty much out of time, so we got to scramble and get out of here for the next show. So let us be on our way. I want to thank you, all of you callers, for calling in, even those guys I got to have a debate with. I thank you all. We'll be back next week. This is John Kane with Shawnee Rice, and this is Let's Talk.
I'm loving the water, seems so calm to me. Loving the water, it comes so naturally. It's a gift from my mother, you can't deny.